Welcome back to the third coastal restoration webinar. Thanks so much for attending again. I feel like numbers are going to be lower because even I was supposed to be at the Suzanne Simard talk that the INT is hosting. And then due to my scheduling prowess, I was like, oh, I'm supposed to talk at the exact same time. So I best cancel my ticket. So if any of you are missing for that reason, you won't hear me now, but good job. That's probably a really cool talk. But yeah, thanks so much for joining us. Eric is missing tonight. That's why you're having to listen to me even more. He couldn't make it, so we have Sarah Campion, longtime camper, longtime McPhail's employee, who is kind of running the system tonight. So thanks again to Sarah for adjusting to that last minute. And yeah, without further ado, though, I think we're getting to be a grooving group. We know what's going on, so I'm going to share my screen and we'll just get right into it. Yeah, do the little hand thing if everything's working and you can hear me and see what I'm seeing, where like hands float up. Do people know how to do that? I'm going to assume it's all working. There's no hands floating. That's cool. All right. So we've been broad and big, and we've covered the whole island and history and different habitats and disparate communities and all kinds of stuff. And this week we're gonna, start looking at the actions, start looking at getting to work, and things to sustain our shore to heal these habitats that are fulfilling all kinds of really cool services. And as always, there's our funder people logo things there. So the province and the federal government and the Climate Challenge Fund. And also, stay tuned for the next one where we'll be continuing to talk about this deeper and deeper. And again, my email address is there. So if you have any questions or anything like that between sessions, um, then please do email me. One thing I think we're going to do, Sarah and I were just talking about it before we started this, is we're going to send out just a short questionnaire to everybody who's participating in the webinar series and make sure the last fourth final episode we can tailor it, to some specific questions if you feel like things haven't been addressed that you're really looking to after this one. Or if we might have a few general questions about what kind of properties you're all living on, so we can maybe, no one's on a dune. We'll stop talking about dunes. Yeah, so if stay tuned for that. Of course, I don't think there's anyone new, but if there is, McPhail Woods is hosting this. I work there, Sarah works there. We're a nonprofit since 1991, doing a whole bunch of cool environmental stuff on PEI, from kids camps to growing awesome species. You can learn more about us on our website. And of course, this is part of the Climate Challenge Fund funding. So we pitched this project and they thought it was pretty cool. So they funded it, and we're very, very thankful. So they've given us the opportunity to run these coastal restoration webinars, but we're also doing volunteer plantings with the PEI provincial parks. I'll have some dates at the end of the slideshow. And we're also growing more and more coastal species, and we're working on that coastal stewardship guidebook, which we'll be releasing for free later on this year. It'll be by this year, definitely, for sure. And yeah, I've talked about this before, but through other great generous government funding and working with all kinds of great stewards and conservation groups across PEI, as well as the First Nations, both Lennox Island and Abequit. We've learned a lot about these habitats. We've had a lot of help protecting them and, working together. And so, those projects and that, a bunch of years of romping around the coast really helped inspire a lot of this. And I'm still getting to do that with UPEI. So we'll have more and more coming out about this stuff. Last week, we talked about communities. Community empowerment, right? We looked at the power of our communities, both historically in the human communities and also our kind of natural animal and plant communities, more than just humans. We kind of looked at the ways that they're tight and interconnected along our coasts, where they're facing harsh conditions and challenging circumstances and changing seasons and storms. We looked at some of the changes that we see in our habitats along our coasts where land meets sea, and how there's this kind of mosaic of habitats, and that Badumagek picture again always represents that to me, of showing all those different interconnected coastal habitats, but you can't really get rid of a bunch of them and still keep one of them. They're all relying on each other for their formation and for their habitat and seed sources and protecting each other. Just like our coastal communities, like the fishermen there and the Cavendish rocks near the dunes there. And all this kind of bigger picture habitat stuff and the process work before that of coastal processes, is really all aimed at our goals of kind of using these native wild spaces to seek solutions for some of our land use issues, whether it be erosion or coastal flooding or storm damage, or, or just starting to go, I don't see as many birds as I used to. So it's all about reinvesting in our natural infrastructure and rebuilding that resiliency. So we've talked a lot about shifting our perspectives so that, our land use where it can be restorative rather than just an extractive process or disruptive process. We can actually, be part of that community and healing that and restoring some of those services.
Dan, I'm just
Mm.
gonna jump in and interrupt. They can't see your screen right now.
Oh no, they can't see my screen at all?
Yeah, like we see you.
That's just been boring then. Oh man. Okay, that's why those hands didn't go up. So wait, you can't see this screen right now? Why isn't that working? Do, 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 do. I'm so sorry, guys. Well, I will. Oh, maybe I never actually pressed the share button. Now can you see it?
I can see it. I'm assuming
Oh,
everybody
there's
else
thumbs
can
are
now
starting to
as
go up.
well.
Okay. I'm gonna skip those ones what we always do, and I'll start at this one. Um, oh, thank you. I'm sorry I did that for so long without realizing it. My apologies. Two out of three of these webinars have gone off pretty good on the technical front. Um, anyway, yeah, so we talked about community empowerment. You can remember all the words I just said a few minutes ago, but there are the pictures. So there's those Cavendish kind of lobster shanties, I'm going to call them. That may be insulting to the people who built them because they look really cool and I can't build that. But, shanty's a good word. That goofy map I spent too long on last time. But yeah, these, kind of different disparate habitats and how some of our coastal communities, we can make a lot of, humans are animals too. And so the way our communities cooperate and intertwine and, have different roles in our communities, you can really kind of metaphor that onto a lot of natural communities when you start thinking about them at different scales, whether it's by species and what their roles are, or whether it's by areas and what that function is of that whole community. And yeah, as I said, it's all about that natural infrastructure rebuilding. So that restorative land use angle. So that's Eric teaching, and Sarah teaches our courses as well. Our chainsaw course, which, it is about cutting down trees, which we say, oh, it's destructive. And it is, but nature's destructive sometimes. It's all right. So it's focused though on, also on species selection and on mimicking natural disturbance patterns. So maybe not clear cutting, but knowing how to safely fell one or two trees to create a really cool windfall patch, kind of mimicking just one or two old trees falling down. It's about, looking at that community and rebuilding those things. So some of those solutions, that's not a bank swallow, that's a tree swallow. I don't have that good a picture of a bank swallow, but similar species and tree swallows can live very close to the coast. They just want to nest in a tree cavity, so they're going to use a box, whereas a bank swallow really doesn't use a box. They want to use the bank. But they're huge insectivores. They fly around eating all the things that bite us along the coast, right? Salt marsh mosquitoes, particularly, are hurt and also are tasty. So, by kind of providing that habitat and rebuilding that infrastructure, we're not just benefiting ourselves, but we're benefiting others, which then often indirectly re-benefits ourselves. So it is selfish, but it's also a mutualistic selfishness, and the goal of today is going to be, kind of guiding through these steps of humble beginnings, the establishment stage where roots are really establishing in the ground, and then eventually this kind of feedback cycle. And those bottom two pictures are from the same site and close to the same angle, just over a few years. The second picture on the right was actually right after Fiona. Was right after Fiona. Um, so it fared Fiona. It's a short little hedge of a forest. It's not, but it is right on the coast in Earnscliffe, and got fields to the north that are completely exposed. And so I was surprised at how well that fared. And larger kind of poplar trees nearby went right down, as well as some plantations. So again, that diversity, the density, and that time to establish, right? And planted with really good specimens. All these things will make a difference, especially in these harsh places. And I know I go on a lot about psychology, philosophy, kind of, changing our perspectives, but it is really important. We got very disconnected as a culture from how these systems work. And especially, when we're inland in a nice valley or field or somewhere, we can get away with that a lot easier because the conditions just are never as extreme or rarely as extreme. But along our coasts, and it depends on the coast. Some of you are going to have properties on really calm coasts that mimic an inland site a lot more than a coastal site, and you can play or get away with other things without worrying about the kind of community resilience that these really harsh coastal sites really need, right, to keep their soils and to resist winds and waves and storms. Um, again, that picture on the left, I've shown this kind of site before, but that's Cabot Beach Provincial Park. And that cliff system, 100-ish years ago, maybe a little more, had a lot more sand on it. It was more of a dune system. You can see the remnant sand there, and you can even see the pile. If you look at the colors of the cliff, there's like a darker red and then that light sand color on top. And that's because like the top of the soil of the cliff is still sand dune. It's just falling off pretty quickly, and that's why those trees are eroding a little faster than they do in some other cliffs. Um, and I'm a naturalist and restorer guy, so you might expect me to be like, we need to rebuild those sand dunes. Um, I'm not saying a hard no. But to me that's a crazy project, and the destruction of getting machines down there to do it, and until there was some kind of a way, uh, I don't think it's going to be a quick fix. So I think accepting that it's a cliff now, we've changed it. We've changed the processes that are depositing sand there. If we zoom out again, um, that's okay. We can work on it as a cliff now, and we can help restore it there, and then we can keep an eye on it, and we can shift plans if dredging patterns change and the sand comes back. Um, Along our coast too, like it's been a hard learning pattern for, I think, for McPhail's in some ways, because we worked on a lot of inland properties and riparian rivers and things like that, and in forests a lot where the conditions, again, you're thinking about shade and stuff, but are calmer, less extreme. And so often a lot of our plantings were 95% plus survival rates and successes, like really, we were too proud. But the coast doesn't always yield that. So that's another picture of those spruce. Actually, two of them are living, one died. They just crumbled right down to nothing because I put them in a really exposed area um, on that coast. And they were a little too large specimens. That's okay. They're now dead wood, the parts of them that are dead that are slowing winds, and we can go plant more things behind it. And so that embracing of ecology is just, sometimes we don't want our cliff to erode, but stopping it's pretty impossible. So if we're going to do a planting, putting it back, letting the sea have another few meters, it's going to take it anyway, and trying to give those plants time to establish their roots before the cliff erodes to them, rather than putting them right at the cliff's edge and having them come off that fall in a storm or just suffer because they're so exposed. Um, and as always, I like laziness. So I like to always point out the lazy. I just put the term lazy river because I just imagine floating along and things getting better. And that does happen. That's how nature works. If we leave things alone, it does naturally recover. It can be stunted, it can be slow, it's very uncontrollable, and on your own properties, there's going to be areas where that's just not a great idea. But there might be areas where it really is. And recognizing those areas compared to areas where you really should be thinking about tending issues that are gonna, it's not that they won't solve themselves, but we might be talking hundreds of year time scale, not in a sustainable fashion that will either save our infrastructure, protect our properties, or just be, adequate for us. And there's birds and things in the meantime in those hundreds of years that don't have a home. But recognizing what areas might need restoration, what areas could use a little bit. This area on the left, that Clear Spring Cliff coast, has a lot of diversity due to that rum running road we talked about last time. Um, a really cool spot. If I could recognize there was one or two species missing that really ought to be in that community, adding in a few specimens as a seed source is an afternoon's job. So maybe that's a low-hanging fruit. And even though that one doesn't need much help, I could do that because I really love it and it's really special. The picture on the right is a parking lot that got smashed up at the national park during Fiona, and then they removed all the pavement, and that's kind of the leftover flattened area. um, it's compacted, it's slaty soils, it is unhealthy. There's not a ton of seed sources directly in the area. Um, it's it's going to be hit by more storms, right? And waves all the time because it's a very windy spot. So that's a really vulnerable area, and waiting for the natural time means more coastline change and more loss of, more erosional effect and all the things our goals might be to avoid. So recognizing kind of the difference between those areas um, at various scales is really important. And that's that idea of succession again, recognizing, okay, if I look closely, it's not grass and weeds, it's actually little spruce trees, and what are those going to do? They're going to grow and they're going to provide protection. So kind of imagining into the future. And again, when we're looking at today, we're going to look at a bit more at assessing, a simple rubric, as simple as we can make it, and then getting to action and, tapping into these productive patterns is really useful. It not only ensures the success of your efforts or improves the success, can't ensure anything, but it makes, you plan once because it's a good plan. You plant once because they were good specimens and they were in the right spot. And then you get to walk away and enjoy and either add to it later. It might be a multi-year plan, or you get to watch it start to really thrive on its own, right? It's as much as I've been spending tons of time talking about these coastal habitats and how complex they are, and they truly are. The, the hardest part or the most complex part sometimes of restoration is it's really a compromise of what we want to see from that place, right? Especially with our own properties. And so, again, if we walk away from that old feel in the bottom right hand corner, it will eventually tree up. It's going to lose some more meters and get smacked by the sea, and those invasive weeds will slow things down, and other ones will speed it up. It's going to be a little, who knows exactly what will happen, but it'll eventually reforest if it was just left alone. Parts of it, some would become shrubby areas. Um, and it doesn't have a mind, it doesn't care. So it's what we want to see with it. And how quickly we want to see those results, and what investments we're putting in. So again, by mimicking those processes, by mimicking these natural patterns, by picking the right species for the right place, and by compromising with some of those forces that we actually, as much as we're humans and we have all this technology and power, there are forces that we can't contend with very well. And so compromising with those forces, whether it's planting back from the cliff, uh, giving some earth back to the sea, but making sure that next layer of defense is well established and strong when it comes time to really resist those waves and winds. Um, or whether it's, just adding seed sources in because I don't have the budget to do a whole hedgerow. That might be all I can do. Maybe it's transplanting specimens or doing cuttings because I just can't get my hands on a whole bunch of others. There's all kinds of ways to kind of tap into that power and use those species. And we talked last time about becoming more specific, and again, just readjusting our view on what's successful and learning from those patterns. Planting things that have these abilities. That's why we're choosing these native species. That wild rose in the middle looks terrible. And there's more dandelion foliage and clover foliage than wild rose. And it does look really dead. And the top died. It was we put in like a 2.5 to 3 foot plant. It was the size we had in a really windy spot. And so that plant had grown in our nursery away from winds, stretched up tall, and said, I'm a big fat rose and I'm really happy about life. And my stems don't even need to be too strong because I'm at the McPhail's nursery. And, plants did not evolve to get up by the roots and move to a new location. And we do that all the time to them. So we took that rose and we put it on a windy coast suddenly in one day, after years of it recording its sunlight and wind patterns and all these things in its body. And so, it didn't like that. It's going through an adjustment period. But the wonderful thing about rose with healthy roots is that it will regrow from its roots from that. And so some of those greenery at the bottom of it near the base are actually new leaves and buds and thorns and flowers to be that are coming back up. So that one died back after the first season of planting, but we knew that was going to happen. The worry was that the whole root base would die too. And as long as that didn't happen, this is going to be slower than it would have been if I planted this in a nice hedgerow somewhere inland, for sure. But that's because it's on the coast, and that's okay. So recognizing where a gnarly tree isn't a bad tree to be cut down, but is actually shielding the green behind it, or recognizing that you put in a young spruce and it's browning more than you'd like, even if it's still alive. And so maybe I could throw a log nearby and let it give it just that tiny bit of shelter it needs. It's just on the edge, and I can adjust the edge. I can't stop the wind, but I can certainly modify it a little bit. And the fun thing is when you get into it, it's like a dramatic soap opera. It's those spruce for a couple of years were pretty touch and go, and I didn't put a log in front of them because we were watching them, right? We were seeing what's going to happen with these spruce. Um, are they going to make it? Is it a multi-year death where they just get weaker every year? Or is it I got hit really hard changing locations. I'm a little too stretched out, especially that guy on the left. Maybe I had some root problems that we didn't see when we were planting it. What is going to happen, right? So it can be a little exciting, and there will be drama like those dunes that I've shown before, but that's the Fiona damage at Blooming Point, and you can see all the old bayberry roots that used to sit atop the dunes um, are exposed now, right? But like wild rose, some of those can grow back from rootstock. Some of those species will grow back from that, and that's meant to get blasted. So if anything's going to get damaged in a big storm along my sandy coast, it's that front dune I want to take the damage. That's kind of my desired damage if I don't have a choice. Um, and there's some cool drama. There's some good moments in the soap opera. That cool yellow flower is cutleaf coneflower. It's an incredibly rare wildflower on BEI, only reported a few times in the western part of the province, often a marsh flower, like not a coastal species. And that's growing in a coastal river up in Naufrage. So I saw it there. We grow it at McPhail's. It's, again, really, really rare. So it surprised me to see it. And I'm pretty sure it's because of the fresh water. It's, of course, from the fresh water from the river that it made it in there. Um, and it's definitely not planted. Nobody planted it. It's like pretty much growing in the riverbed. Uh, but my guess is, and who knows, is that someone bought a coneflower from McPhail's on a property nearby and planted it, and one of the seeds got down to this little coastal riparian zone, which isn't where it's exactly known to grow, and that one's doing great. There's a couple of them, so just like that surprised me, and very cool to see potentially the legacy of some of the plants that we're putting out there because again, really rare species, only Western PEI, and old reports, all the old reports say only Western PEI. So kind of neat. So just, sometimes really important to contextualize the catastrophe we're seeing and start understanding what role we're playing in the way that we're stewarding the land or planting our things, or maybe it's not a role we're playing and it's looking at coastlines further down. That was a property I was assessing, and that's post Fiona damage. This is down in the right hand corner. And you can see all the buoys near the fallen tree. And that's actually like a little bit inland. I'm like 250 meters or something inland. So the flood waters really went in there. But the big problem with that property is they didn't that property's coast isn't where they came in from. They came in from someone else's property's coast. So they can strengthen their boundary between those two properties, but they can't really solve that problem on their own. And that's going to happen. And so you make adjustments, but it's good to know it because otherwise you feel like you're failing, if especially if you're trying to fix the problem and nothing's working. And it's a labor of love because these are harsh places. I really like that picture of Eric, and it just, you can see how exposed they're quite far back from the coast in that top left picture. That's Macy, another great McPhail's employee. She does a bunch of our graphic design, chainsaws things, and then also plants stuff and teaches kids camp. So jack of all trades. But yeah, you can see how exposed they are despite being so far back. And that's land use, right? That's because those are mowed fields and agriculture area, which is great. That's a cool, productive area. There is that cool clump of trees or bushes or whatever you want to call them. And that is providing a slight bit of protection, right? Not a ton. Um, but these are the things that you're kind of starting to think about, is just looking at that, and instead of just seeing a beautiful island picture, which it also is, but starting to go, oh, I see an exposed coastline. I don't see anything slowing wind or holding roots in the ground. Oh man, I'm pretty far back and I'm still getting blasted by winds. And again, not to be like, oh, this is all bad, but to just start going, oh, okay, so the choices we're doing by, letting that coast develop or farming right to the edge might be having effects on whether my silo got wind damage, during Fiona. Um, and it can be a really massive undertaking. I find nowadays we undervalue labor, because planting is hard work and it's also knowledgeable work. One of the things I find that I notice the most is, we as much as we love trees and plants and stuff, we sometimes forget they're a living thing, especially when they're in a pot. And so those plants, the way we plant them is going to affect their health. If we have their roots too bound, or we don't dig a big enough hole, or if the hole's lopsided and the water only collects on one side and the other side stays dry, all of these different things will have effects on how that plant grows and functions and holds soils and thrives. So planting each one well, with the right amendments and good root sizes and all those kinds of things, or putting logs nearby for leaking out water later, right? In a wild place where we don't mind some logs in the ground, we're not scared of tripping over them. All of those different things can be extremely important. So the actual labor of planting, we've got some videos on it and some more stuff, and there'll be more written about it in the guidebook for sure. But that whole process is important for each one, especially in harsh conditions. You can get away with shoddier planting technique in a calmer conditioned place, but especially along these hurt or harsh or sensitive coasts, it's the way we plant them is going to definitely matter. So these are really general. These are adapted. These are Gary's restoration guidelines, and really these are adapted from all kinds of sources as well as Gary. Um, but they're for the forest. But most of them really still, all of them, but the particular ones really still apply along our coasts, and maybe even more so. And we've talked about all of these in passing, even if I haven't maybe said it specifically. We've talked about how letting our habitats get old and change with succession lets them build biodiversity and resilience and increase all the functions they're providing us. Um, we're going to talk more. I haven't talked a ton about deadwood yet, and it's a tough one because when we see a gnarled deadwood tree or there's a bunch of logs on the ground, do we think, oh, a mess, gotta tidy it up? But deadwood is an incredibly important component. It's a recycling of biomass and nutrients and water retention, to all of our soils. And in the forest, it's hugely important, but along our coasts, it's really important too. So we've been using that a lot, especially after Fiona, right? There was a ton of dead wood around. So it's really easy to find little logs and stuff, to build wind barriers or provide kind of wooden, slowly rotting sponges that soak up water during rains and in the hot summer days releases it. These are really, as much as they're just pieces of wood, that's what nature uses, and so they're incredibly fertile and helpful for that. We're going to talk more about species next time, specific species, but yeah, we've talked a lot about native species. The waterways ones obviously really applies. for coastal areas, but I'm not going to go deep into that one. Um, Soil succession. Yeah, no, managing the light might be the one that applies the least along our coastal areas unless you've got a full-on coastal forest going. Light is always important. Plants are taking light, energy, and then using that to mix alchemical solutions they grab out of other areas of air and earth to make their own food. So their light is really important. And but along our coasts, especially if you're doing kind of, you know, property restoration in areas that have been disturbed, you're usually in a high light situation. You're getting a lot of light. So you do want species that don't mind a lot of light. Hemlock, for instance, or our beech trees generally want to be in a shaded, more sheltered place. They also don't like wind, so you're probably not going to choose one of them. But white spruce, marram grass, bayberry, those are all really first successional, early successional species that really thrive in high light situations. So you're still thinking about light, but it's less than in a true forest. Some of the pictures on the right there are just, we're starting to look at some of the different techniques and concerns. The picture on the bottom right is looking at one of the national park plantings and using those kind of we kind of made little Krumholtz gardens is how I thought of them. We didn't have the budget to actually plant the whole area in the density needed in this high wind situation. So we chose to make small protected gardens that would act as kind of seed sources and spreading places. And as they established, they would provide the material, whether it be like things spreading through the roots, or we put in some of those kinds of species, as well as the seeds that will spread in the area, and provide protection and change the conditions in kind of a staggered way. So we're seeing that's only a couple of years ago we put that planting in. It's still doing well, but we're still continuing to monitor that to see how that kind of approach works. But so far, good results. And sometimes there's post-planting amendments. You see Jasmine, another McPhail's employee, caging a young planting that is in a little coastal forest. Um, you know, that's not going to stop wind. It's a cage, but there's a lot of snowshoe hare there because it's a young forest, right? And so we don't mind them eating. They're part of the community, but we're going to protect our particular trees that we're trying to get established there, especially when we're working on putting in new seed sources that are really important. I'm just going to check in. Sarah, is there any questions that I should attend to, or
No, we're doing good, but if anybody has any questions, feel free to put them down in the Q&A.
thank you so much. All right, so assessing, I know you know your property, but getting to know your property with this kind of new, glasses on, and that is our prototype assessment rubric there on the right. Where that we'll have a final one in the book, so things are subject to change. But again, the aim of it is to concentrate. We already gone over all of this. That's, you thought I was being broad, but I had plans in the earlier episodes of this. And so, a lot of these things, we're going to go through them again and explain them a little more and a little more practically. But we know the answers to a lot of these things because I've been trying to use these terms and show off these processes. And really, that's what we're trying to do here is just come up with a nice way to group all this stuff in our head because it's a complex system, and not take away the complexity, but just kind of give it some of that generality we need for making good plans and becoming good stewards. So the pictures on the left, we've looked at before. I'm kind of repeating some pictures because it's kind of fun to go look back at the coastal picture. You may go, oh, I remember seeing that, and then go, oh, I'm seeing it with new eyes. So you can just answer these really kind of simple, kind of the first four questions are really those big, large force questions. What is the exposure, right? What kind of coast is your property on? And then some questions that start to hone those growing conditions. What are your local wind speeds? And I'm not, again, we don't have to get to a number. You totally can get the devices to measure wind now. Kestrel, I think, is the company that makes them. They're like not that much money in the grand scheme, a couple of $100. If that's a fun thing for you to set a tripod and a little wind station up, that's cool. I mean, play with that data. You can make cool graphs and you can understand it in nuanced ways. It's not practical all the time, and especially for the way I've done it is I'm on a person's property potentially once, hopefully more, but maybe only one time assessing it. So you're looking for those patterns and clues. Same with our soil conditions. They're just telling us about how much water is available and what kind of issues are we going to face with erosion. 5 and 6, those other questions are adding more detail, and we'll keep going on this. But yeah, so the picture on the left just kind of starts to break down some of those properties with just some of those basic categories, right? So that cliff picture on the right, the naufrage cliffs, that running road, you can see it's pretty uniform, that whole picture, as far as the habitat types. Like you can see, I've kind of talked about how there's like the trees that are wind deformed, and then there's like areas that are more shrubbery. But if we're answering just those first four questions on the rubric, it's a cliff. That's an easy coast type. Oh, sorry, exposure first. It is coastal. It's right on the coast. It's not in a bay. It's not an estuary. Um, you know, it's coastal. It's a cliff. Soil drainage, pretty moderate. There's no seepy areas, and there's not sand blowing or big bare dry areas. It's pretty moderate. Um, and it's Krumholtzing. The coastal intensity, for the most part, is strong. Of course, it's stronger near the edge of the cliff, and it weakens as you head into that thicket of spruce trees. But effectively, on average, it's a really strong deformity place. So we're going to worry about the power of wind all the time, not just windstorms. The picture below is a very different coast, very typical island coast, but different. It is a coastal exposure, but you can see I wrote in a sub thing, a secondary attribute, right? I said South Shore because coastal on the South Shore and coastal on the North Shore, if you know, they're different. So putting those little, you can add details to these. You can start as broad as you want. That's just meant to cover the bases. And then you can add detail and finesse. Same with the cliff type there. It is a cliff, I'm going to call it. Not much of one, so I said it's a low cliff, but it's going to face a little more erosion than a salt marsh would, right? Um, I said it was a breezy deformity. That's kind of like the second level because those trees look fat and thick. And if we went over there, there's kind of like a shrub area. There is some dead branches near the coast at the very edge of the cliff. That to me is saying it's a pretty windy spot. It's not like the most windy. It's not Krumholtzing. It's not windy all the time, but it's definitely more windy than a typical inland sheltered spot. And again, soil drainage, a lot of PEI is just what I call moderate. You don't have to think too hard about getting plants or worrying about flooding. Sorry, not flooding, but like water pooling in one spot. So we can kind of take this and you can play with it. Again, as I said, this is a prototype I'm kind of working on, or the team at Fails will be working on, and it'll be in the coastal guidebook we're putting out. But as you can see with all these different coasts, maybe you want to stretch a coast that has a couple, you can break it down and say, well, I got a sandy area and this cliff area, so I can kind of run the assessment for both because things will change. They might have a very similar coastal intensity because they're pretty proximate to each other, but the soil drainage might change quite a bit between the two areas. Um, you know, um, in other areas, maybe it's not worth doing multiple assessments, but just adding some of those nuance and secondary characteristics. So the picture on the top right is Brudenell Provincial Park, and that's the cool path heading out into it's a river, but it's like pretty salt river. It's near the mouth, yeah, I think that's the right term. Um, and so it's pretty brackishy, salty water, and still has coastal tides. So it's like riverine, estuarine. It's kind of I'm not picking one category. It's got a bit of both. And it's also got cliff and low plain. There's a little bit of cliff, but it kind of other areas are pretty low. Kind of waters can lap right up onto the land really easily. And we can look at the fact that it's not that windy, although that island is much more exposed. So we can mark all these different things down, and we can get specific about it. We could add a map in and then really specify it, but we may not need to if it's our own little property. So again, this rubric is meant to be flexible, but simple enough that, you could do most of it with a pretty easy visual assessment. You're not sitting there with an anomanometer, running that for weeks. We're doing really in-depth soil tests. All of those things are useful. They're fun. So I'm not discouraging them. But at the end of the day, just asking some of these, especially these first four questions, you can start to, excuse me, understand some of the forces at play, some of the challenges and other things you're going to face. So yeah, so when it comes to exposure, again, we've been over this, but you're just kind of looking at where you're located on the coast, or even if you're inland or you're at the top of a hill, do you have much shelter around you as far as forest and other things go? Um, and your exposure changes across your property, of course. So again, you can break up different areas if you have very different exposure. It doesn't just have to be an assessment across just the whole property. So there's just some simple questions to ask and then some considerations. If you're on a coastal property, you're always exposed to coastal forces all the time. Winds, waves, the whole thing. If you're on a cliff, you may not get the brunt of the waves that you see, but they're still whacking the side of your cliff all the time. But that means you're just thinking about everything all the time. It's a tough coastal exposed site, right? And if you, when we get to wind intensity, we'll add in the complexity of whether or not it's always really strong or whether you're just always exposed, but it's actually, a calm coast. Um, the cool thing about a coastal site compared to some of our, especially an exposed coastal site, is often the trees there, if they are krummholzing or otherwise just blasted a lot, they're stronger for it if they survive, and they often do. So you end up with, as much as you're always dealing with coastal forces, when the big storms come through, you actually sometimes weather it better. Um, Depends on your habitats and your own property. Estuaries, on the other hand, it's not that they don't deal with winds. You can be in a very windy estuary, but on the whole, many of our estuaries have lower average winds. They're lower elevated, so they're not like stuck up into the winds like a cliff is. And so the big thing you're going to be thinking about often if you live along an estuary or a bay or somewhere along the south shore, a low plain kind of rolling in, um, then you're really thinking about coastal flooding often because the winds and waves are not so strong that you're going to always experience sand in your face and gnarled trees. But when they are strong, especially during coastal events, those winds and waves can penetrate quite far. And so, especially in those habitats where the trees grow pretty straight right to the shore, they do that because they're not usually blasted by wind. So when a wind event comes through and floodwaters or big winds hit them at the right angle, they're more susceptible to breakage or wind throw. So estuary habitats are one of those ones where like you're not thinking about some of the coastal effects as often, but the big bad dangerous storms actually you might want to prepare for those more. But again, so just by judging your exposure, you're already starting to go, hey, I might have these problems. And we could go over these for riverine and inland. I include those as categories because I think this assessment I'm trying to be holistic and it could approach sites. Some inland sites are actually pretty darn exposed to winds, not so much the waves, but the winds are still very strong. So some of these coastal strategies might work there, just different sets of species. And also, you can, again, group categories together. So I might be on a coastal site, but I might have an inland field that's, 250 meters inland and behind some buffer of forest. So it's calmer, but I'm really still pretty coastal. So I could be a coastal inland site, and that could tell me about these different worries that I have. I gotta speed it up. Oh no. Yeah, so again, cliffs and bluffs, low plain, salt marsh, and dune systems. There's a variances amongst each of those categories, but grouping them in those three systems really generally covers a lot of what the bigger, broader stuff you want to know. Cliffs and bluffs, again, if you're exposed and on a cliff and in a high wind area, which we'll deal with the intensity next, you're really, really exposed. You're high up. You're thinking about erosion when it comes to cliffs and bluffs, whereas salt marshes and dune systems are generally depositional. It's not that erosion can't happen, but on the whole, there should be sediment being dumped there, again, unless dredging or some process has changed. Low plain systems could be either. They're just places where the shore kind of just rolls into the water, very susceptible to coastal flooding. Some of them are on depositional areas, like our salt marshy areas, and some of them can be really close to our cliffs and bluffs where the elevation just gets really low and they're still actually kind of erosional areas, just flatter. Um, yeah, so again, breaking it down and easy questions, right? Am I near a salt marsh? Am I on the top of a cliff or in a dune? But these will start to make you aware of maybe my soil mediums. If I'm on a cliff, drainage usually, Western PEI takes some exception to this sometimes, is usually medium, not usually high. Most cliffs are pretty moderate in their drainage patterns because the soils are pretty thin. So even if they're sandier soils, they retain water. It doesn't go very far from the top. Dune systems, though, are going to have dry sand, so you're going to think about those plants that specialize in being able to grow into that. So just by recognizing your coastal type, how sandy your soil is there, you're going to start having good species lists and getting ideas for where you might be susceptible to easier erosion or coastal flooding. Yeah, this category is the hardest one, maybe, or the weirdest one. But again, trying to simplify it using that Griggs-Putnam deformity kind of pattern, we can start to group all these names of gusty, breezy, windy are all subject to change. I'm playing with by trying to simplify jargon, you end up making more jargon, and then you get confused by that jargon. So I don't know what the solution is yet, but effectively, there's a pattern of increasing deformation, and the more deformed tree is, the windier that spot is and has been historically. Um, we could get into reading the tree's growth form and stuff. You can do some really cool specimen specific looking through the history of wind patterns. Um, and as you can see from those pictures, every tree is deformed a little differently. So again, you're trying to get maybe looking for your most deformed tree and basing it on that, or looking for, uh, you know, the average level of deformity. Or if you're only planning to plant in a certain area, or to work in a certain area, or to build in a certain area, or you're only having problems you want to address in a certain area, check out the trees closest to that area to get an idea of that local area's average winds, right? So again, those crumholzing places, if you've got gnarly trees and it's a crumholzing spot, that's okay. If you've got gnarly trees and you're in a calm coast, there's something's causing gnarly trees that's not wind. Could be bugs or, who knows what. But, so being aware that that deformation is because of wind, and in that setting, it's really normal and actually a powerful growth form to resist those conditions and to be able to create a whole habitat. Windy habitats will have that deformation and sometimes really extreme. So that dune picture that says windy, you can see the trees really close to the coast. Some have died. Some are just, they're they're quite bent over to the side, right? But you get only a little bit inland and that force or that deformation stops. So that's what I would call a windy, where right along your coast, you might have to worry about that kind of wind power, but it slows pretty quickly. It's not powerful enough. It kind of frictions out real fast. So then you're less worried about wind, just a little bit inland, and it gives you a few more options being aware of that for things you can plant. A lot of the South Shore is what I'd consider breezy, where the trees are a little thicker, they don't grow quite as tall, and there's still lots of shrubbery and windfall on occasion. Um, but affected by the coast definitely, but maybe not. Obviously it's pretty subtle. And then I'd say the whole island's windy, so everywhere else is gusty, which just means that it's windy enough some of the time that you will see damage from storms, but not so much that deformity index, because that takes strong winds all the time, not just like a big storm. So again, not studying that, but looking at this on your property or on your neighbor's property. Because I've been on properties where there is no trees that are old enough or deformed enough or giving you any indication, because they're all cleared. But you can look down the coast a bit. And again, it will get a little bit less specific to your property. But if it's just further down the cliff and there's some trees that are really crumholzing, well, whatever you want to do on your property is likely going to experience similar winds, maybe a little lower, maybe a little higher, but close to it. So sometimes looking to a neighbor or just down the coast a bit is a good way to use this kind of technique. And again, you can break up different areas. We'll actually talk about that a little bit. Yeah, so soils, you want to look at those? We've talked a lot about that. A lot of soil stuff is just about water. It's not so much, you can get into nutrient stuff, but when you're dealing with native species, a lot of the nutrient stuff, they will sort out. and we don't understand it particularly well. So when you're looking at soils, you're really thinking about, is it wet? Is it dry? How fast does it drain through? So low drainage isn't always a clay soil, but clay often makes low drainage. A medium drainage doesn't always have loamy soil, but if you have a loamy soil, it's just likely a medium drainage, unless there's like bedrock right underneath or some other weird thing happening. Same with sandy, high drainage are associated. So I'll group those all together. So you're kind of noting areas where you've got really low or really high drainage. If it's medium drainage, just consider that you're like baseline normal. And then also whether or not you have freshwater or salty water areas. So whether it's a salt marsh or a freshwater area, really important for if you're going to do any restoration work, the species you choose will have to be able to withstand salts if it's brackish water. So again, it's not rocket science, but putting those things together, then you add on, allows you to start making some really good, either break your property up or just having good assessments about your property. Uh, then you can start looking at that community in the state it's in, right? Because once you get those ideas, you start to be like, oh, I am on a dune system, so I should have maybe some white spruce or black spruce if I have a wet area. And you can look for them, right? And when I say look for, I put species in quotations when I said that little question there that says what species are, growing in the canopy or whatever. Because I go by species, I know my species and I like IDing them down to the species, and that's fun. It's great. But you could also be like, I got needle trees, more needle trees than I have leaf trees. And that's still telling you something, right? It's a windy place, or it was recently farmed, or the full sun. Maybe the only seed source nearby is the needle trees. But it's telling you about your place, right? And it's somewhere to start. So again, you're trying to break it up into those useful groups of saying, okay, do I want to look at my primary trees, my primary shrubs, and then whatever's growing in the ground? Maybe that's a good breakup. Maybe I want to think about it more in the terms of a functional perspective. So I'm going to look at different areas and what is that? I don't even, it's not all the species I need to know about, but is this area kind of like trapping water or filtering flood water, or is this area structurally slowing winds? And I could look at it that way, right? So there's a whole bunch of ways you could break that down. Obviously, species is the common one we all think of, but we don't have to just name them all. We can think about them in different ways, and whatever list we come up with is better than no list. And if the list that you get, like that bottom right hand picture, is no list because there's just really nothing there but a bit of clover grass and one spruce tree, that's worth noting too, because that lack of biodiversity is telling you about a bereft community that's not going to be fulfilling a whole bunch of functions. And then when we're thinking about biodiversity, it's great to note any species at risk, like those bank swallow holes. I don't necessarily see the bank swallows all the time, but if I can recognize their dens and be aware of where they are, I can report it to the Island Nature Trust in the province. I can make sure to steward that particular part of my coast a little differently. I can watch for distinctive, I have a typo there, distinctive or sensitive habitats, and noting those highly disturbed or vulnerable habitats. Again, being able to hone in on areas that I really need to help fix or help grow, or areas I want to make sure I don't disturb or even maybe enhance. And of course, I said simple rubric. Haha. You can always dig deeper. There's lots of interesting things to think about. I mentioned thinking about primary trees and shrubs. If you're in a coastal forest, you might think about canopy, sub-canopy, shrub layer, ground cover, regeneration of young trees. Like you might break it into even more layers if you get into it, or if that's your goal. Um, you know, Getting and looking at those soils can reveal cool stories. So the bottom right hand picture is a forest up near Stanhope. And it's just like a weird old spruce forest. Kind of looks like it's an old field forest when you're walking up the road in the beginning. But when you actually walk into it, there's these mounds that are sand, and then there's the dune plants. That's that dune mushroom, the earth star mushroom. These are old dunes, and this is what happens to a dune that gets calm and settled and far enough inland that spruce get onto it and other species, and it becomes a dune forest, right? Um, we don't see these too often because a lot of our dunes are so young they don't hit this point. So it's kind of fun to find these areas and go, oh, this is actually, it shifted my view. Walking up to it from the road, I was like, oh, another old field forest. I've been in lots of these. Cool. I'm going to go assess it, but not the most exciting day. And figuring out it's an old field dune forest just added a little spice to the otherwise, long, hot, uh, open sun field assessment. And of course, you can take that assessment and not just do it for your whole property. You can zone up your property, right? You can break it up into areas. We looked at that a little bit last time with, I think it was Cedar Dunes Park, but there's Jacques Cartier. And again, those zones aren't based fully just on ecology. They're based on use. They're based on threat. They're based on somewhat on ecology. And they're just trying to break those up into areas where we want to think about our treatments, sorry, not treatments, but our stewardship, where we're facing the same problems, or we're working with the same natural community, or we have an aligned goal, and maybe even a goal that's a little bit removed from ecology, like a campground area. you know um, in my plans, I can make suggestions of ways to improve that within that zone. I can say, okay, anywhere we can enhance a hedgerow or add shrubs between campsites is all going to enhance protection, build pollination, do all these things for the whole community. I know we can't take away the campsites, so it's balancing that, and that's sometimes the hardest part. And there is lots of resources beyond my ramblings. So a few of them there. The Prince Edward Island Historical Map Viewer is awesome. You can scroll around PEI and go to all kinds of cool old aerial photos as well as historic maps and look at your own property and see how what's happened through time. It's sometimes surprising and very interesting. The Coastal Hazard Assessment website, you can actually book a coastal hazard assessment, where someone will come out from the province and help you assess your coastal hazards. And then they have other online resources like the Chris one we looked at last time. And then Climb Atlantic. I always want to say climb. It's Climb Atlantic, but Climb Atlantic is coastal adaptation toolkit, as well as other resources. They're like a regional wide climate coastal adaptation, and not just restoration, but various different things and policy work. But they have lots of great resources. And well, I built way too long a slideshow because I think there's like even more, but we're hitting the 7:30 mark. And I know last time I was like, I'm going to barge ahead and just continue onwards, but I can also save um, the planting part until next time. So I don't know if people want, I maybe have, trying to see how many slides. Yeah, there's like a good 10 slides or so. So I'm very happy to keep going, but I'm also happy to do it next time. Is there any comments on that? I guess I can probably look at comments.
No questions so far on that, but there is someone asking if you could repeat the name of the PEI historical maps.
Oh, sure. I will go back a slide. Oh, nope. Where is it there? Prince Edward Island Historical Map Viewer and GeoPEI. It's a part of the UPEI Geo Reach Lab. McFadden, is the name coming to mind. He does really, I could have his name wrong, so I apologize to him if I want to give him proper credit, but he does really cool work looking through historical records and imagery, and then putting that into geographic information systems to be able to map it all out as well. Anyway, he does a whole bunch of cool stuff. Very, very cool. But that's if you Google GeoPEI Historic Map Viewer PEI, it'll come up, and then you can check out some really fun stuff on that. And then the province also has aerial photos that you can like download the JPEGs. It's just clunkier to use, but you can extract the photo for yourself a little easier in a higher quality. So both are good. But the GeoPI kind of lets you just float around. So it's like, I don't know, you can spend an evening floating around the coast, looking at the 1935 aerials, and then going back to Meacham's Atlas and seeing who owned the property and whether that family still does. There's really fun, weird tangents you can go on. I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to go a few slides more, and I will stop before we get to the placement stuff, and I'll save that for next time. If that works, I'm going to, yeah, okay, thumbs are happening. So we talked about this. So yes, so again, after you've done that assessment, or before, or while you're doing that assessment, while you're thinking about your goals and your projects and all these things, there's all these other questions, of course, you have, right? My favorite one, I bolded it, is what happens if I do nothing? It's a really important question to ask. That could be changing action to inaction, like we've talked about not mowing. But it could also be like, if you look at the picture on the top right, that's Point Prim. The lighthouse is like behind me, and I'm taking a picture of the wind-blown, smashed forest. And it got hit. It's an exposed Point Prim, right? Very windy South Shore spot. But what happens if I do nothing there? And honestly, there's a lot of shrubs. There's tons of birds. There's wild rose. There's bayberry. There's winterberry holly. There is young spruce nestled in there when I thornily walked through. Um, it's not that bad. It doesn't look great, and it changed drastically from the pictures from last year. Prior to Fiona, not last year, but at the time of this. And that's my adjustment. I could go in and plant 100%. I love planting, and I'm never going to say don't do that. But is that my priority depending on what my property is? If I do nothing there, it actually is going to just keep recovering, and it will recover reasonably quickly. A site like that Delvey parking lot won't, right? And so again, just asking that question sometimes solves a problem, and you don't have to do much. Or you can even stop doing something like mowing, or pruning something that you hate pruning. These things can happen. So that bottom picture is from Cameron Island, and again, that's another one where I can say what happens when I do nothing. And the big difference there is that place actually has a few more invasives and is missing some species that I think would be really useful, and they wouldn't be hard to get in there. So if I do nothing, it'll be fine. But maybe I can say, if I do nothing, what if I just do a little bit? What happens if I do a little bit? What's the least thing I could do that would have the biggest effect? I should add that to my question list. That's a good question too. But yeah, thinking about your goals, think about how much you want to do yourself, right? Because you have to pay for this effort in some form. And it could be your own body. That's very fun. I don't mean that in a negative sense. That sounded like threatening. Your own body. Um, what I mean though is like you can hire a place like McPhail's or a landscaper or whoever to come do the work, and that's going to be expensive, right? Um, that's how that is usually. You can do it yourself, and it can be sweaty. So it's how much do you want to do yourself? What's your budget, right? Because one of the things when we hit private landowner stuff with McPhail's is that's one of our first questions is what's your budget? And there's no greed in the question. It's because if you just want me to make an ideal plan for how to restore your habitat, oh, I could sink money, right? Like everything can use help. And there's always something new to do. And if you give it a year, you'll see new things. And the things you did will have created other things that could probably use some pruning and so getting an idea and just what's your budget, not just money budget, but what's your budget of time? What's your budget of how much do you want to invest every year? Because it will be a multi-year, it's a stewardship thing, right? And what skills are you lacking, or do you want to build, or do you have no interest in building? Nothing wrong with not being interested in aspects of it, right? So just asking through some of those questions and being aware of those in line with that assessment, with those dangers and qualitators in mind about whether I'm on a cliff and maybe I'm not, my budget's low, but my erosion's bad and I'm on a tall cliff and I've got coastal exposure and I'm in Krumholtzing winds. Ooh, I might want to think about that, right? I'll have to come up with a compromise, and that's often the hardest part. Really basic botany. We do whole courses on this, and the more you know, if you're working with these native systems, we could do a whole zoology thing, but honestly, you're not going to prune a squirrel. Uh, you might end up planting and pruning and working with these plants that are kind of become the structural basis for the habitat, as much as the animals are a really important part too. So understanding, that the top of the tree and the roots are a bit of an equation. They got to balance each other. They're feeding each other. So if I get a tree from a nursery and it's 6 feet tall but has no roots whatsoever, that's not a good buy. It's not a healthy specimen. And just knowing that it's going to make your plantings, especially along the harsh coast, way more successful, right? Wood kind of grows year after year like Lego, adds little layers. It keeps its history in itself, which is why that Krumholtzing effect allows us to read the history of winds on that tree's body, right? And it responds to its conditions, whether it's a fire, whether it's light, whether it's dry year, whether it's insect pests. They're very physical creatures, and we could go into that. We do whole pruning courses, right? But knowing how that process works, when you look down at that yellow birch in the middle with the 4 or 5 stems, right? Um, that's a plantation yellow birch. And so yellow birch is a tree that often grows in a shady forest and has a beautiful single stem and that golden bark. In a plantation, at about 2 feet off the ground, it said, I'm at the top of the canopy because it wasn't in a forest. And so it made a canopy. at 2 feet tall. So it has a 2 foot trunk and then a very impressive canopy. But it got that canopy when it was very young, and all those branch connections are pretty breakable, weaker, places where water and rock can rest, right? So again, that's a very busy, cool tree. It's great for a kid to climb, but if I'm looking to make a strong, long-lived yellow birch, I either need to plant it in some shade so it doesn't do that, or I would need to prune it, right? So just there's all these various botanical things um, that getting this really general basis, which we provide some free workshops and as well as some paid ones throughout the year, and lots of other people do across PEI and the region, can really enhance your planting if you're going to be doing it yourself. If you're hiring someone, that's why you're paying them. They should know this stuff. But along the coast, these things can matter more because those weak connections, like that yellow birch has, um, you know, those are more exposed to high wind breakages, right? Our soils, if they're poor, when we're blasted by winds and salts and abraded by sands, we want the most nutrients and water retention and mulching on top of our plantings as possible, right? Or shelter created through logs, because those logs in a natural setting again fall and provide shelter and water and nutrients to all the plants in the forest around them. And so we're going to try to mimic that as much as we can, right? And sometimes it's about building a big enough community to deal with stuff. So that top right picture is a really thin hedgerow that went down at the top of a hill. That's actually inland. I included an inland picture. I'm terrible. But it's because it was just a really thin forest. It was only like 100 meters wide because they farmed all around it. And that's, fair enough. They wanted to farm a bunch of stuff. But then that forest is just all exposed, just like it's on the coast. But they're not coastal trees that are strong because they develop that wood pattern uh, without that wind most of the time. And so that storm really knocked it all down, right? So just recognizing those patterns allows us to plan for them better and to ensure that our plantings go really well. Yeah, I think it is 7:37. We'll go into coastal law next time. Yeah, so next time we're going to talk a bit more about some seaside specifics. So taking those coastal restoration guidelines that I said, the Gary's guidelines, and kind of honing in on some of the ones that really, and adding to some that really help along coastal plantings. Um, we're going to look at, different ways of setting up your planting, some post-planting stuff to think about, pre-planting stuff, some different setups and densities and those kinds of things. We're going to look at zones a little more because in our high wind settings and along different places, we have a pretty zany zonation sometimes, but it can be useful to recognize in those high wind settings because it can really help inform what you're dealing with and what you're going to put where when it comes to restoration plantings. And yeah, these patterns are predictable and useful, and you can do it on the ground or you can do it with weird data. Um, those are just experiments of mine to try to figure out whether these things I was seeing were real. So I went to the virtual world to see if it was real, and maybe. And then we're going to look at those patterns in a more very specific way and get into talking about some of these sweet, sweet species, and hopefully find one of these weird pictures I've made that matches a coast you live on. And so you can go, I live on a low plain coast. Now I can see exactly what to plant. And then I'll tell you that those lists are not comprehensive and subject to change, and there's many more species that you ought to know about. But we'll look at those things. I'm going to skip through that. We're going to do a case study of Victoria Park that I was planning. And I went way, oh man, I had so much more planned. Who knew? Yeah, so next time we'll do that when we're doing species for the coasts, withstanding winds and strengthening shores. Again, May 16th is our first coastal community planting. Please come out to Cabot Provincial Park. It's a super awesome park, need of some help, but also lovely. And you should come out and get your hands dirty. And I'm happy to take questions, but I also recognize I went over time. So again, feel free to send email questions. Feel free to ask questions now. And I promise we will be sending out a short questionnaire to make sure we hone next time in the last few ways for whatever you need. And I'm going to stop screen share. Done. I'm taking the what looks like 0 questions. as 0 questions.
But there was one floating heart that went by.
Oh,
Oh,
awesome.
and a
Okay.
thumbs up.
I'll take a floating heart and a thumbs up. When you're up in the void, you'll take anything you can get. No, thank you so much for attending again. Please do await our survey because I do really want to. I know that people are still like, he still hasn't said exactly how many meters to put things, which is fair. I'm bad at that sometimes because I'm all feely. But what I do say is that we will send out a survey. Please fill that out. And then if we miss a question and or a topic that you're really, really wanted to cover, just send us an email. And if we can't get through to it, then you know what? Email me later or come out and have a chat, right? That would be super fun. So maybe we can do a webinar in person. It's not a reunion because we've never met in person, but you know, like a pre-union. No, that's anyway. I'm done talking. I'm tired. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.